It was one of those crisp autumn mornings in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The air smelled fresh and the sun shone just enough to take the chill off. A man named Robert, who worked as a federal prosecutor, was driving through the streets on his way to an important meeting at the U.S. Attorney's office. Dressed sharply in a suit that screamed professionalism, he was focused but running slightly behind schedule. Robert wasn't someone you'd expect to find in trouble with the law. He spent most of his days fighting for justice, working tirelessly to bring criminals to account and protect innocent people. But today, fate decided to throw him a curveball, one that would change how he saw the world forever. As he approached an intersection, Robert noticed there were no cars around, just a stop sign standing lonely under the morning light. In a moment of distraction, or maybe because he didn't think it mattered much, he rolled through the stop sign instead of coming to a full halt. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't dangerous. It was just human. But little did Robert know Officer James, a rookie cop eager to make a name for himself, was parked nearby, watching everything unfold. For James, this was an opportunity to prove himself, maybe even earn some praise from his superiors. So without hesitation, he flipped on his flashing lights and pulled Robert over. When Robert saw the police car behind him, his heart sank a bit. "Oh, great," he muttered under his breath. Still, he remained calm. After all, he knew he hadn't done anything serious. Rolling through a stop sign? Sure, it wasn't perfect, but it certainly didn't deserve more than a warning, right? As Officer James approached the car, things started feeling a little strange. Instead of asking routine questions or checking Robert's license and registration, James seemed unusually suspicious. His eyes scanned the interior of the vehicle, the expensive leather seats, the neatly folded papers on the passenger seat, the government ID clipped to the dashboard. None of it seemed to ease his demeanor. "Do you know why I stopped you?" James asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Yes, officer," Robert replied politely. "I may have rolled through the stop sign back there." "My apologies. I wasn't paying close attention." Instead of letting it go, James pressed further. "You realize rolling through a stop sign is reckless driving, don't you?" Robert blinked, taken aback. Reckless? That felt like a stretch. But he kept his cool. "Officer, if I may, I can show you footage from the security cameras near the intersection. They'll confirm I wasn't speeding or behaving recklessly." James didn't seem interested. If anything, he looked annoyed. "Save it for the judge," he said flatly before handing Robert a ticket for reckless driving. For a moment, Robert wanted to argue. How could this be happening? He had credentials proving who he was, evidence showing he hadn't done anything wrong. And yet here he was being treated like someone trying to wriggle out of trouble. But he chose not to push back. Arguing with an officer on the side of the road wouldn't help. Instead, he took the ticket silently, thanked James for his time, and drove away, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Little did Robert know, this was only the beginning of a story that would test his patience, challenge his beliefs, and ultimately teach him something profound about fairness, bias, and the power of second chances. A few weeks passed after the traffic stop, and Robert tried to put the whole incident behind him. Life moved on. He went back to his demanding job as a federal prosecutor, working long hours preparing cases, meeting with colleagues, and standing in courtrooms where justice was supposed to be blind. But there was one thing nagging at the back of his mind: the reckless driving ticket. The summons arrived in the mail, instructing him to appear in court for the violation. At first, Robert thought about paying the fine and moving on. After all, it wasn't worth the hassle, right? But something inside him pushed back against that idea. Paying the fine felt like admitting guilt for something he didn't believe he had done wrong. And besides, if he let this slide, what message would that send? Would it mean accepting unfair treatment just because it was easier? So when the day of the hearing came, Robert showed up dressed in his usual professional attire, a crisp suit, polished shoes, and a calm demeanor. He walked into the courthouse feeling confident, ready to explain his side of the story. What he didn't expect was how quickly things would spiral out of control. The courtroom was packed with people waiting for their turn, some nervous, some bored, others clearly frustrated. When Robert's name was called, he stepped forward and stood before Judge Richard Whitaker, a man known for being strict and no-nonsense. From the moment Whitaker looked up from his papers, Robert could tell this wasn't going to go smoothly. "Mr. Roberts," the judge began, glancing briefly at the file in front of him, "you've been charged with reckless driving. Do you admit to violating traffic laws?" Robert cleared his throat and spoke respectfully. "Your Honor, I'm not disputing that I rolled through a stop sign. However, I want to clarify that my actions were neither reckless nor dangerous. There were no other vehicles or pedestrians around at the time, and I believe the charge is excessive." Whitaker raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Rolling through a stop sign is still breaking the law, Mr. Roberts. Laws exist for a reason, to keep everyone safe." "I understand that, Your Honor," Robert replied patiently. "But I'd like to present evidence from nearby security cameras that show exactly what happened. It will prove that I wasn't behaving recklessly." Before Robert could say more, Whitaker cut him off. "This isn't a trial for murder, Mr. Roberts. It's a simple traffic violation. You broke the law, and now you need to face the consequences." Robert felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't how the system was supposed to work. As a prosecutor, he knew better than anyone that evidence mattered. Facts mattered. Yet here he was, standing in front of a judge who seemed unwilling to even consider his perspective. He tried again, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of following traffic laws, but labeling this as reckless feels disproportionate. All I'm asking is for a fair evaluation of the facts." Whitaker leaned back in his chair, looking down at Robert over the rim of his glasses. "Let me make this clear, Mr. Roberts. If every person who got pulled over started arguing about video footage or claiming exceptions, we'd never get anything done. Now, do you have anything else to add? Or shall we proceed?" For a split second, Robert considered pressing further. He could demand to see the officer who wrote the ticket. He could insist on presenting the camera footage right then and there. But deep down, he realized it wouldn't make a difference. The judge had already made up his mind. "No, Your Honor," Robert said finally, his tone measured but tinged with resignation. "I have nothing further to add." Without missing a beat, Whitaker announced the verdict. Fine of $500. Next case. Just like that, it was over. Robert stood there for a moment, stunned. $500 for rolling through a stop sign. It felt absurd, almost surreal. He glanced around the courtroom, half expecting someone to step in and point out how ridiculous this was. But no one did. Everyone else was too busy focusing on their own problems. As Robert left the courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling of frustration bubbling inside him. This wasn't just about the money, it was about fairness, or rather the lack of it. He had followed procedure, presented his case calmly, and yet none of it seemed to matter. For the first time in his career, he found himself questioning whether the justice system truly worked the way it was supposed to. On the drive home, Robert replayed the events in his head. The dismissive attitude of the officer during the traffic stop. The judge's refusal to listen. The entire process felt impersonal, mechanical, and deeply flawed. Was this how ordinary people experienced the legal system? People without fancy suits or government IDs clipped to their dashboards? That night, as he sat alone in his living room, Robert allowed himself to feel angry, not just at the situation, but at the larger implications. If someone like him, a federal prosecutor, someone who lived and breathed justice every single day, could be treated this way, what hope did others have? And yet, even in his frustration, a small part of him refused to give up. Maybe this was a wake-up call. Maybe this experience could teach him something valuable about the very system he worked so hard to uphold. Whatever the lesson was, Robert knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of the story. Life has a funny way of throwing surprises when you least expect them. For Robert, the days following his court appearance felt heavy. He couldn't shake off the frustration or the lingering sense that something wasn't right. But instead of letting it consume him, he decided to channel his energy into something productive. After all, dwelling on what had happened wouldn't change anything, but maybe using his experience could. Around this time, An email landed in Robert's inbox. It was an invitation to speak at a judicial conference, a high-profile event aimed at addressing some of the biggest challenges facing the legal system today. The topic? Implicit bias and its impact on everyday interactions between citizens and law enforcement. At first, Robert hesitated. Was this really the right platform for him to share his thoughts? Could he turn his personal frustration into something meaningful? After a few moments of reflection, he accepted the invitation. If there was ever a chance to shine a light on the cracks in the system, this was it. The day of the conference arrived, and Robert found himself standing backstage, reviewing his notes one last time. His heart raced, not from nervousness, but from excitement. This wasn't just another public speaking gig. It was an opportunity to spark real conversations about fairness, accountability, and trust within the justice system. When Robert stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on him. Judges, lawyers, police officers, and policymakers, all gathered to learn and discuss ways to improve their profession. As he began to speak, his voice carried both authority and vulnerability. "I've spent years working as a federal prosecutor," he started, pausing briefly to scan the crowd. "My job is to ensure that justice is served fairly and impartially. But recently I experienced something that made me question whether our system always lives up to that promise." He went on to recount the story of the traffic stop, the unnecessary ticket, the dismissive officer, the judge who refused to listen. He didn't name names or point fingers, but he painted a vivid picture of how even someone like him, someone deeply embedded in the legal world, could feel powerless when faced with bias. "Imagine being pulled over for a minor infraction," Robert continued, his tone steady but passionate. "Imagine explaining your side of the story only to be ignored because of assumptions based on appearances. Imagine walking away feeling like the system failed you, not because you're guilty, but because you don't fit a certain mold." The audience listened intently, many nodding along. Some scribbled notes while others exchanged knowing glances. Robert knew not everyone agreed with him, but he also knew they couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. As he wrapped up his speech, Robert emphasized the importance of self-awareness and empathy. "We all have biases. It's part of being human. But we can't let those biases cloud our judgment, especially when people's lives are at stake. Whether you're a judge, a lawyer, or a police officer, your decisions matter. They shape not just individual outcomes, but the very foundation of trust in our society." When he finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. People lined up to shake his hand, thanking him for his honesty and courage. Among them was Judge Richard Whitaker, the same man who had fined Robert months earlier. At first, Robert didn't recognize him. The judge approached awkwardly, extending his hand with a sheepish smile. "That was quite the presentation," Whitaker said, his voice tinged with unease. "You made some excellent points." Robert froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Here was the man who had dismissed his case without a second thought, now complimenting him on a speech about fairness and bias. Irony didn't even begin to cover it. "Thank you, Your Honor," Robert replied cautiously. "I appreciate the feedback." Whitaker hesitated, then added, "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something personal." Curiosity got the better way, and Robert gestured toward a quieter corner of the room. Once they were out of earshot, Whitaker took a deep breath. "I think I owe you an apology." Those words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Robert blinked, caught off guard. An apology? From a judge? This was unexpected. "I remember your case," Whitaker admitted, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "Well, sort of. I handle so many cases every day that sometimes they blur together. But after hearing your speech, pieces started coming back to me. The suit, the calm demeanor, the insistence on presenting evidence." Realization dawned on Robert. Whitaker was talking about his case, the reckless driving ticket, the rushed verdict, the $500 fine. "I treated you unfairly," Whitaker confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't take the time to truly listen, and honestly, I think my judgment might have been influenced by, well, things I shouldn't have considered. For a moment, Robert didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to lash out, to demand answers or vent his frustrations. But another part of him saw something remarkable in this moment. A man in a position of power admitting his own flaws. That kind of humility wasn't easy to come by. Finally, Robert spoke. Your Honor, I appreciate your honesty. What happened, it wasn't just about me. It highlighted bigger issues in the system. Issues we need to address if we want to build trust and fairness. Whitaker nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right. And I'd like to make amends. Not just for what happened to you, but for others who might have been treated the same way. Robert looked at the judge, seeing him not as an adversary, but as someone willing to grow. Maybe this twist of fate wasn't just about closure for him. Maybe it was the start of something bigger. The conversation between Robert and Judge Whitaker didn't end in that quiet corner of the conference hall. Instead, it stretched into something deeper, a raw and honest exchange that neither man had anticipated. As they stood there, surrounded by the hum of networking attendees sipping coffee and chatting about legal reforms, the two men found themselves diving into a dialogue that would change both of their perspectives. Whitaker began hesitantly, almost as if he were afraid his words might come out wrong. I've been thinking a lot about what you said during your speech, he admitted, his voice softer than before. About how small moments of bias can add up over time. I never really thought about it that way, not until today. Robert nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. He could tell this wasn't easy for the judge. Admitting fault, especially in a profession built on authority and impartiality, took courage. I'll be honest, Whitaker continued, clasping his hands together tightly. When I first saw you in my courtroom, I made assumptions. You were dressed well, driving an expensive car and insisting on presenting evidence like you knew better than everyone else. I guess I let those things cloud my judgment. I assumed you were trying to use your position to get out of trouble. Robert listened intently, his expression unreadable. On one hand, hearing Whitaker's admission was validating. It confirmed what he'd suspected all along. But on the other hand, it was infuriating. How many others had been treated this way because of similar assumptions? How many people without his background or connections had walked away feeling powerless? I understand why you might have thought that, Robert replied finally, choosing his words carefully. But here's the thing. Those assumptions don't just affect me. They affect everyone who steps into a courtroom. Whether they're guilty or innocent, people trust the system to treat them fairly. When that trust is broken, it erodes confidence in the entire process. Whitaker sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. You're right. And I hate to admit it, but I've probably done this before to other people. Not intentionally, of course, but still. He trailed off, shaking his head. For someone used to making decisions from the bench, owning up to mistakes must have felt foreign and humbling. Yet Robert noticed something genuine in Whitaker's demeanor. This wasn't just lip service, the man seemed truly remorseful. That's why I wanted to talk to you, Whitaker said after a pause. I don't want to make excuses for what happened. What I want to know is, what can I do differently moving forward? The question caught Robert off guard. He hadn't expected Whitaker to ask for advice or solutions. Most people in positions of power would have stopped at an apology. But here was a judge, openly acknowledging his flaws and asking how to improve. It was rare, and it gave Robert hope. Well, Robert started, leaning slightly forward as if to emphasize his point. The first step is recognizing that biases exist, even in people who think they're immune to them. The second step is actively working to counteract those biases. That means listening more, assuming less, and giving everyone the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise. Whitaker nodded, absorbing every word. Listening more, he repeated softly, almost to himself. That's something I clearly failed to do with you. Robert smiled faintly. We all fail sometimes. What matters is what we do next. The two men talked for nearly an hour. covering everything from systemic issues within the justice system to personal experiences with bias. Whitaker shared stories of his early days as a lawyer, when he believed the law was black and white, no shades of gray. Over time, though, he realized how complex and nuanced the system truly was, and how easy it was to lose sight of fairness amidst the chaos. Robert, in turn, opened up about his own struggles. "Being a prosecutor doesn't shield me from bias," he admitted. "In fact, it makes me hyper-aware of it. Every day I see how decisions, big and small, can shape someone's life forever. That's why I fight so hard to ensure those decisions are based on facts, not assumptions." By the end of their conversation, it was clear that both men had gained something valuable. For Whitaker, it was a renewed sense of purpose, an opportunity to reflect on his role in the system and how he could contribute to positive change. For Robert, it was validation that his experience wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger pattern, one that required collective effort to fix. Before parting ways, Whitaker extended an invitation. "If you're serious about addressing these issues," he said earnestly, "maybe we could work together. Training programs, workshops, whatever it takes to help judges and officers recognize their blind spots. I think your perspective would be invaluable." Robert raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued. "You'd really be open to that?" "Absolutely," Whitaker replied without hesitation. "If we're going to rebuild trust, we need to start somewhere. Why not here?" For the first time since the traffic stop months earlier, Robert felt a glimmer of optimism. Maybe this whole ordeal wasn't just about him getting fined unfairly. Maybe it was about creating a bridge between two individuals, yes, but also between communities and institutions that desperately needed to reconnect. As they shook hands and went their separate ways, Robert couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he believed real progress was possible. The days turned into weeks, and what started as an awkward conversation between Robert and Judge Whitaker blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated: a partnership aimed at fixing cracks in the justice system. It wasn't just about making amends for past mistakes. It was about building a foundation for fairness and accountability that would last long after they were gone. Their collaboration began with small steps. They met regularly to brainstorm ideas, often sitting across from each other in Whitaker's modest office or over coffee at a quiet cafe near the courthouse. At first, their discussions focused on personal growth, how Whitaker could become more mindful of his biases and how Robert could use his experience to advocate for change. But soon their conversations grew bigger, bolder, and more ambitious. One evening, as they pored over notes scribbled on napkins and legal pads, Whitaker leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, this isn't just about us. If we're serious about creating real change, we need to bring others into the fold." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "I agree. The problem is systemic, not individual. To fix it, we have to address the root causes, the attitudes, policies, and practices that perpetuate bias." That's when they came up with the idea: training programs designed specifically for judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officers. These workshops wouldn't just lecture participants about bias. They'd challenge them to confront their own assumptions through interactive exercises, role-playing scenarios, and open dialogue. The goal was simple yet profound: to help people see the humanity behind every case, every decision, and every interaction. Whitaker took charge of organizing the logistics, leveraging his connections within the judicial system to secure funding and support. Robert, meanwhile, focused on crafting the content, drawing from his years of experience as both a prosecutor and someone who had been on the receiving end of unfair treatment. Together, they assembled a team of experts, psychologists, educators, and community leaders to ensure the program was comprehensive and impactful. When the first workshop launched a few months later, the turnout exceeded their expectations. Dozens of judges, attorneys, and police officers filled the room, eager to learn and engage. For many attendees, it was their first time confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves and the system they served. Some resisted initially, defensive, about being labeled biased. But as the sessions unfolded, walls began to crumble. One particularly powerful exercise stood out. Participants were asked to imagine themselves in the shoes of someone accused of a crime or pulled over for a minor traffic violation. They had to consider factors like race, socioeconomic status, and even clothing choices. By the end of the EOR activity, several attendees admitted feeling uneasy and enlightened. "I never realized how much I relied on stereotypes," one judge confessed during a group discussion. "It's scary to think about how that might have influenced my decisions." Another officer chimed in, visibly moved. "I joined this job to protect people, but sometimes I forget they're human beings too." This has been eye-opening. Hearing these reflections, Robert felt a swell of pride. Change wasn't going to happen overnight, but moments like these proved it was possible. And Whitaker? He watched silently from the sidelines, occasionally chiming in to share his own journey of self-discovery. Seeing him so vulnerable inspired others to do the same. Beyond the workshops, Whitaker took additional steps to make amends for his earlier mistake. He formally overturned Robert's reckless driving conviction, issuing a written statement acknowledging the error. "Justice demands fairness," he wrote. "In this instance, I failed to uphold that standard. I deeply regret any harm caused, and hope this action serves as a reminder of our collective responsibility to strive for equity." He also refunded the $500 fine, though Robert insisted on donating the money to a local nonprofit focused on criminal justice reform. "It's not about the money," Robert told Whitaker. "It's about using this moment to create something meaningful." As word of their efforts spread, Robert and Whitaker became unlikely symbols of hope. Their story appeared in newspapers, on podcasts, and even during panel discussions at national conferences. People marveled at how two individuals from opposite sides of the courtroom had come together to tackle such a complex issue. Critics questioned whether their partnership was genuine or merely performative, but those who knew them personally saw the sincerity in their actions. For Robert, the experience reinforced his belief in the power of dialogue and persistence. "Change doesn't happen because we wish for it," he often said. "It happens because we work for it, even when it's hard." And for Whitaker, it was a lesson in humility and leadership. Admitting fault wasn't easy, but it allowed him to grow, not just as a judge but as a person. "Being fair isn't about never making mistakes," he reflected during one speech. "It's about owning those mistakes and doing everything in your power to prevent them in the future." Over time, their partnership evolved beyond workshops and speeches. They co-authored articles, testified before legislative committees, and lobbied for policy changes aimed at reducing bias in policing and sentencing. Their combined influence helped push through reforms that benefited countless individuals caught in the crosshairs of an imperfect system. But perhaps the most significant impact was personal. Through their collaboration, Robert and Whitaker discovered a shared purpose, one rooted in empathy, integrity, and a commitment to justice. They weren't perfect, and neither was the system they sought to improve. But by working together, they reminded everyone involved that progress was always within reach if only we dared to reach for it. Years passed, and the story of Robert and Judge Whitaker became more than just a footnote in the legal world. It grew into a legend. Their unlikely partnership had sparked conversations that rippled far beyond their small corner of the justice system. From classrooms to courtrooms, from police stations to legislative halls, people talked about how two men who started as adversaries ended up changing the way countless others approached fairness, bias, and accountability. For Robert, the journey was deeply personal. It wasn't just about vindication or proving a point. It was about showing that even those at the top of the legal ladder weren't immune to the flaws of the system they served. He often reflected on how different things might have been if he hadn't decided to speak up after his traffic stop. Would he have let the frustration eat away at him? Or would he have shrugged it off as just one of those days? Instead, he chose to turn his experience into action. By sharing his story openly, he gave a voice to others who felt silenced. By similar encounters with authority figures, people began reaching out to him, ordinary citizens who had been treated unfairly, officers looking for guidance on how to improve their interactions, even judges seeking advice on remaining impartial. Each message reinforced why he had stayed, committed to this cause. Judge Whitaker, too, underwent a transformation. The man once known for his stern demeanor and quick verdicts became a champion of empathy and reflection within the judiciary. His colleagues noticed the shift, not just in how he handled cases, but in how he interacted with defendants, attorneys, and staff. Where there used to be impatience, there was now understanding. Where there had been rigidity, there was flexibility. One day, during a routine hearing, Whitaker found himself presiding over a case involving a young woman accused of shoplifting. She stood nervously before him, her hands trembling as she explained that she'd stolen food because she couldn't afford groceries for her children. In the past, Whitaker might have handed down a harsh sentence without hesitation. But now, something stirred inside him, a reminder of the lessons he'd learned alongside Robert. After listening carefully to both sides, Whitaker made a decision that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Instead of sentencing the woman to jail time, he connected her with local resources to help her get back on her feet. Justice isn't about punishment alone, he told the court. It's about finding solutions that benefit everyone involved. That moment became emblematic of Whitaker's new approach, one rooted in compassion and problem-solving rather than retribution. And while not every case allowed for such leniency, his willingness to consider context over convention earned him newfound respect among peers and the public alike. The ripple effects of their work extended far beyond individual cases. The training programs they launched continued to grow, reaching jurisdictions across the country. Judges who attended reported feeling more confident in their ability to identify biases, while officers credited the workshops with improving community relations. Even skeptics who initially dismissed the initiative as touchy-feely nonsense admitted that the exercises forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, and that was exactly the point. Robert and Whitaker also inspired others to step forward with their own stories. A retired detective shared how implicit bias had influenced his investigations early in his career, leading to wrongful arrests. A defense attorney recounted how stereotypes had nearly cost an innocent client their freedom. These narratives added depth to the conversation, reminding everyone that bias wasn't just a theoretical concept, it had real-world consequences. As time went on, Robert and Whitaker occasionally crossed paths at conferences, meetings, or casual dinners. Their relationship had evolved from professional collaborators to genuine friends. They joked about how ironic it was that fate had brought them together through a traffic ticket, a minor infraction that turned into a life-altering experience for both of them, but they never lost sight of why they started this journey in the first place. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Whitaker turned to Robert and said, "You know, I'll always regret what happened that day in my courtroom, but I'm grateful for it too. If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have learned half of what I know now." Robert smiled, nodding slowly. "Me too," he replied. "Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we need the most." Their partnership proved that redemption wasn't reserved for criminals or victims. It was available to anyone willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work towards something better. For Judge Whitaker, it meant confronting his biases and striving to be fairer. For Robert, it meant using his platform to advocate for systemic change. Together, they showed that justice wasn't just about laws and rules. It was about people, their dignity, their humanity, and their right to be treated equally. In the end, their story wasn't just about a fine or a misunderstanding. It was about two individuals choosing to rise above circumstance and rewrite the narrative, not only for themselves but for future generations. It was proof that even in a flawed system, progress was possible. All it took was courage, humility, and a willingness to listen. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the park, Robert and Whitaker sat quietly, side by side. Neither spoke, but neither needed to. They knew they had made a difference, not just in their own lives, but in the lives of countless others. And sometimes that was enough.